What deceptive tactics must be used to keep the fantastic journey a secret? Jules Verne, today on the Classic Tales podcast. Welcome to the Classic Tales podcast. Thank you for listening. The vintage episode for the week is A Case of Identity, a Sherlock Holmes story by Arthur Conan Doyle. Be sure to check it out on Tuesday. If you have found value in the show, please consider becoming a monthly supporter. Help us to help other folks like you. Please go to ClassicTalesAudiobooks.com and become a monthly supporter today. Classic Tales for Children, Volume 1, is now available. It includes the new recording of Pollyanna, bundled together with Winnie-the-Pooh, The Wind in the Willows, and Alice in Wonderland. This anthology is perfect to listen to again and again. You can pick it up at ClassicTalesAudiobooks.com by following the link in the show notes. And now, A Journey to the Center of the Earth, Part 2 of 9, by Jules Verne. Chapter 7. A Woman's Courage. Thus ended this memorable séance. That conversation threw me into a fever. I came out of my uncle's study as if I had been stunned, and as if there was not enough air in all the streets of Hamburg to put me right again. I therefore made for the banks of the Elbe, where the steamer lands her passengers, which forms the communication between the city and the Hamburg Railway. Was I convinced of the truth of what I had heard? Had I not bent under the iron rule of the Professor Leidenbrock? Was I to believe him in earnest in his intention to penetrate to the center of this massive globe? Had I been listening to the mad speculations of a lunatic, or to the scientific conclusions of a lofty genius? Where did the truth stop? Where did error begin? I was all adrift amongst 1,000 contradictory hypotheses, but I could not lay hold of one. Yet I remembered that I had been convinced, although now my enthusiasm was beginning to cool down. But I felt a desire to start at once, and not lose time and courage by calm reflection. I had at that moment quite courage enough to strap my knapsack to my shoulders and start. But I must confess that in another hour, this unnatural excitement abated. My nerves became unstrung, and from the depths of the abysses of this earth I ascended to its surface again. "It is quite absurd," I cried. "There is no sense about it. No sensible young man should for a moment entertain such a proposal. The whole thing is non-existent. I've had a bad night. I have been dreaming of horrors." But I had followed the banks of the Elbe and passed the town. After passing the port, too, I had reached the Altona road. I was led by a presentiment, soon to be realized, for shortly I espied my little Gräuben, bravely returning with her light step to Hamburg. "Gräuben!" I cried from afar off. The young girl stopped, rather frightened perhaps to hear her name called after her on the high road. 10 yards more, and I had joined her. "Axel!" she cried, surprised. "What? Have you come to meet me? Is that why you are here, sir?" But when she had looked upon me, Gräuben could not fail to see the uneasiness and distress of my mind. "What is the matter?" she said, holding out her hand. "What is the matter, Gräuben?" I cried. In a couple of minutes my pretty Virlandaise was fully informed of the position of affairs. For a time she was silent. Did her heart palpitate as mine did? I don't know about that, but I know that her hand did not tremble in mine. We went on 100 yards without speaking. At last she said, "Axel!" "My dear Gräuben." "That will be a splendid journey." I gave a bound at these words. "Yes, Axel, a journey worthy of the nephew of a savant. It is a good thing for a man to be distinguished by some great enterprise." "What, Gräuben? Won't you dissuade me from such an undertaking?" "No,
"No, my dear Axel, and I would willingly go with you, but that a poor girl would only be in your way."
"Is that quite true?"
"It is true."
Women and young girls, how incomprehensible are your feminine hearts. When you are not the timidest, you are the bravest of creatures. Reason has nothing to do with your actions. What? Did this child encourage me in such an expedition? Would she not be afraid to join it herself? And she was driving me to it, one whom she loved. I was disconcerted, and if I must tell the whole truth, I was ashamed. "Gräuben, we will see whether you will say the same thing tomorrow."
"Tomorrow, dear Axel, I will say what I say today."
Gräuben and I, hand in hand, but in silence, pursued our way. The emotions of that day were breaking my heart. After all, I thought, the calends of July are a long way off, and between this and then, many things may take place, which will cure my uncle of his desire to travel underground. It was night when we arrived at the house in Königstrasse. I expected to find all quiet there, my uncle in bed as was his custom, and Martha giving her last touches with the feather brush. But I had not taken into account the professor's impatience. I found him shouting and working himself up amidst a crowd of porters and messengers who were all depositing various loads in the passage. Our old servant was at her wit's end.
"Come, Axel, come, you miserable wretch!"
my uncle cried from as far off as he could see me.
"Your boxes are not packed, and my papers are not arranged. Where's the key of my carpet bag? And what have you done with my gaiters?"
I stood thunderstruck. My voice failed. Scarcely could my lips utter the words, "Are we really going?"
"Of course, you unhappy boy. Could I have dreamed that you would have gone out for a walk instead of hurrying your preparations forward?"
"Are we to go?" I asked again, with sinking hopes.
"Yes, the day after tomorrow, early."
I could hear no more. I fled for refuge into my own little room. All hope was now at an end. My uncle had been all the morning making purchases of a part of the tools and apparatus required for this desperate undertaking. The passage was encumbered with rope ladders, knotted cords, torches, flasks, grappling irons, alpenstocks, pickaxes, iron-shod sticks, enough to load 10 men. I spent an awful night. Next morning I was called early. I had quite decided I would not open the door. But how was I to resist the sweet voice which was always music to my ears, saying,
"My dear Axel?"
I came out of my room. I thought my pale countenance and my red and sleepless eyes would work upon Gräuben's sympathies and change her mind.
"Ah, my dear Axel," she said, "I see you are better. A night's rest has done you good." "Done me good?" I exclaimed.
I rushed to the glass. Well, in fact, I did look better than I had expected. I could hardly believe my own eyes.
"Axel," she said, "I have had a long talk with my guardian. He is a bold philosopher, a man of immense courage, and you must remember that his blood flows in your veins. He has confided to me his plans, his hopes, and why and how he hopes to attain his object. He will no doubt succeed. My dear Axel, it is a grand thing to devote yourself to science. What honor will fall upon Herr Liedenbrock, and so be reflected upon his companion. When you return, Axel, you will be a man, his equal, free to speak and to act independently, and free to—"
The dear girl only finished this sentence by blushing. Her words revived me. Yet I refused to believe we should start. I drew Gräuben into the professor's study. "Uncle, is it true that we are to go?"
"Why do you doubt?"
"Well, I don't doubt," I said, not to vex him. "But, I ask, what need is there to hurry?"
Time! Time! Flying with irreparable rapidity."
"But it is only the 16th May, and until the end of June."
"What? You monument of ignorance! Do you think you can get to Iceland in a couple of days? If you had not deserted me like a fool, I should have taken you to the Copenhagen office, to Liffender and Company, and you would have learned then that there is only one trip every month from Copenhagen to Reykjavik, on the 22nd.
Well?
Well, if we waited for the 22nd June, we should be too late to see the shadow of Skartaris touch the crater of Sneffels. Therefore, we must get to Copenhagen as fast as we can to secure our passage. Go and pack up."
There was no reply to this. I went up to my room. Gräuben followed me. She undertook to pack up all things necessary for my voyage. She was no more moved than if I had been starting for a little trip to Lübeck or Heligoland. Her little hands moved without haste. She talked quietly. She supplied me with sensible reasons for our expedition. She delighted me, and yet I was angry with her. Now and then I felt I ought to break out into a passion, but she took no notice and went on her way as methodically as ever. Finally, the last strap was buckled. I came downstairs. All day, the philosophical instrument makers and the electricians kept coming and going. Martha was distracted. "Is Master mad?" she asked.
I nodded my head.
"And is he going to take you with him?"
I nodded again.
"Where to?"
I pointed with my finger downward.
"Down into the cellar?"
cried the old servant. "No," I said. "Lower down than that." Night came, but I knew nothing about the lapse of time.
"Tomorrow morning, at 6 precisely," my uncle decreed, "we start."
At 10 o'clock I fell upon my bed, a dead lump of inert matter. All through the night, terror had hold of me. I spent it dreaming of abysses. I was a prey to delirium. I felt myself grasped by the professor's sinewy hand, dragged along, hurled down, shattered into little bits. I dropped down unfathomable precipices with the accelerating velocity of bodies falling through space. My life had become an endless fall. I awoke at 5 with shattered nerves, trembling and weary. I came downstairs. My uncle was at table, devouring his breakfast. I stared at him with horror and disgust. But dear Gräuben was there, so I said nothing, and could eat nothing. At 5:30 there was a rattle of wheels outside. A large carriage was there to take us to the Altona railway station. It was soon piled up with my uncle's multifarious preparations.
"Where's your box?" he cried.
"It is ready," I replied with faltering voice.
"Then make haste down, or we shall lose the train."
It was now manifestly impossible to maintain the struggle against destiny. I went up again to my room, and rolling my portmanteaus downstairs, I darted after him. At that moment, my uncle was solemnly investing Gräuben with the reins of government. My pretty Virlandaise was as calm and collected as was her wont. She kissed her guardian, but could not restrain a tear in touching my cheek with her gentle lips. "Gräuben," I murmured. "Go, my dear Axel, go. I am now your betrothed, and when you come back, I will be your wife." I pressed her in my arms and took my place in the carriage. Martha and the young girl, standing at the door, waved their last farewell. Then the horses, roused by the driver's whistling, darted off at a gallop on the road to Altona. Chapter 8. Serious Preparations for a Vertical Descent. Altona, which is but a suburb of Hamburg, is the terminus of the Kiel Railway, which was to carry us to the Belts. In 20 minutes we were in Holstein. At 6:30 the carriage stopped at the station. My uncle's numerous packages, his voluminous impedimenta, were unloaded, removed, labeled, weighed, put into the luggage vans, and at 7 we were seated face to face in our compartment. The whistle sounded, the engine started, we were off. Was I resigned? No, not yet. Yet the cool morning air and the scenes on the road, rapidly changed by the swiftness of the train, drew me away somewhat from my sad reflections. As for the professor's reflections, they went far in advance of the swiftest express. We were alone in the carriage, but we sat in silence. My uncle examined all his pockets and his traveling bag with the minutest care. I saw that he had not forgotten the smallest matter of detail. Amongst other documents, a sheet of paper, carefully folded, bore the heading of the Danish consulate with the signature of W. Christiansen, consul at Hamburg and the professor's friend. With this, we possessed the proper introductions to the governor of Iceland. I also observed the famous document, most carefully laid up in a secret pocket in his portfolio. I bestowed a malediction upon it, and then proceeded to examine the country. It was a very long succession of uninteresting, loamy, and fertile flats, a very easy country for the construction of railways, and propitious for the laying down of these direct level lines so dear to railway companies. I had no time to get tired of the monotony, for in 3 hours we stopped at Kiel, close to the sea. The luggage being labeled for Copenhagen, we had no occasion to look after it. Yet the professor watched every article with jealous vigilance, until all were safe on board. There they disappeared in the hold. My uncle, notwithstanding his hurry, had so well calculated the relations between the train and the steamer that we had a whole day to spare. The steamer Eleonora did not start until night. Thence sprang a feverish state of excitement, in which the impatient, irascible traveler devoted to perdition the railway directors and the steamboat companies and the governments which allowed such intolerable slowness. I was obliged to act chorus to him when he attacked the captain of the Eleonora upon this subject. The captain disposed of us summarily. At Kiel, as elsewhere, we must do something to while away the time. What with walking on the verdant shores of the bay, within which nestles the little town, exploring the thick woods, which make it look like a nest embowered amongst thick foliage, admiring the villas, each provided with a little bathing house, and moving about and grumbling, at last 10 o'clock came. The heavy coils of smoke from the Eleonora's funnel unrolled in the sky. The bridge shook with the quivering of the struggling steam. We were on board, and owners for the time of 2 berths, one over the other, in the only saloon cabin on board. At 1:15, the moorings were loosed, and the throbbing steamer pursued her way over the dark waters of the Great Belt. The night was dark. There was a sharp breeze and a rough sea. A few lights appeared on shore through the thick darkness. Later on, I cannot tell when, a dazzling light from some lighthouse threw a bright stream of fire along the waves. And this is all I can remember of this first portion of our sail. At 7 in the morning we landed at Korsør, a small town on the west coast of Zealand. There we were transferred from the boat to another line of railway, which took us by just as flat a country as the plain of Holstein. 3 hours traveling brought us to the capital of Denmark. My uncle had not shut his eyes all night. In his impatience, I believe he was trying to accelerate the train with his feet. At last, he discerned a stretch of sea.
"The sound!"
he cried. At our left was a huge building that looked like a hospital. "That's a lunatic asylum," said one of our traveling companions. Very good, thought I. Just the place we want to end our days in. And great as it is, that asylum is not big enough to contain all Professor Liedenbrock's madness. At 10 in the morning, at last, we set our feet in Copenhagen. The luggage was put upon a carriage and taken with ourselves to the Phoenix Hotel in Breda Gate. This took half an hour, for the station is out of the town. Then my uncle, after a hasty toilet, dragged me after him. The porter at the hotel could speak German and English, but the professor, as a polyglot, questioned him in good Danish, and it was in the same language that the personage directed him to the Museum of Northern Antiquities. The curator of this curious establishment, in which wonders are gathered together out of which the ancient history of the country might be reconstructed by means of its stone weapons, its cups, and its jewels, was a learned savant, the friend of the Danish consul at Hamburg, Professor Thomsen. My uncle had a cordial letter of introduction to him. As a general rule, one savant greets another with coolness. But here the case was different. Monsieur Thompson, like a good friend, gave the Professor Liedenbrock a cordial greeting, and he even vouchsafed the same kindness to his nephew. It is hardly necessary to say the secret was sacredly kept from the excellent curator. We were simply disinterested travelers, visiting Iceland out of harmless curiosity. Monsieur Thompson placed his services at our disposal, and we visited the quays with the object of finding out the next vessel to sail. I was yet in hopes that there would be no means of getting to Iceland, but there was no such luck. A small Danish schooner, the Valkyria, was set to sail for Reykjavik on the 2nd of June. The captain, Monsieur Bjarne, was on board. His intending passenger was so joyful that he almost squeezed his hands till they ached. That good man was rather surprised at his energy. To him, it seemed a very simple thing to go to Iceland, as that was his business, but to my uncle it was sublime. The worthy captain took advantage of his enthusiasm to charge double fares, but we did not trouble ourselves about mere trifles.
"You must be on board on Tuesday, at 7 in the morning,"
said Captain Bjarne, after having pocketed more dollars than were his due. Then we thanked Monsieur Thompson for his kindness, and we returned to the Phoenix Hotel.
"It's all right, it's all right," my uncle repeated. "How fortunate we are to have found this boat ready for sailing. Now let us have some breakfast and go about the town."
We went first to Kongens Nye Tor, an irregular square in which are two innocent-looking guns, which need not alarm anyone. Close by, at number 5, there was a French restaurant, kept by a cook of the name of Vincent, where we had an ample breakfast for 4 marks each. Then I took a childish pleasure in exploring the city. My uncle let me take him with me, but he took notice of nothing, neither the insignificant King's Palace nor the pretty 17th-century bridge which spans the canal before the museum, nor that immense cenotaph of Thorwaldsen's, adorned with horrible mural painting, and containing within it a collection of the sculptor's works, nor in a fine park the toy-like chateau of Rosenberg, nor the beautiful Renaissance edifice of the Exchange, nor its spire composed of the twisted tails of 4 bronze dragons, nor the great windmill on the ramparts, whose huge arms dilated in the sea breeze like the sails of a ship. What delicious walks we should have had together, my pretty Virlandaise and I, along the harbor, where the 2-deckers and the frigate slept peaceably, by the red roofing of the warehouse, by the green banks of the strait, through the deep shades of the trees, amongst which the fort is half concealed, where the guns are thrusting out their black throats between branches of alder and willow. But, alas, Gräuben was far away, and I never hoped to see her again. But if my uncle felt no attraction towards these romantic scenes, he was very much struck with the aspect of a certain church spire, situated in the island of Amak, which forms the southwest quarter of Copenhagen. I was ordered to direct my feet that way. I embarked on a small steamer, which plies on the canals, and in a few minutes she touched the quay of the dockyard. After crossing a few narrow streets where some convicts, in trousers half yellow and half grey, were at work under the orders of the gangers, we arrived at the Vorfrelsers Kirk. There was nothing remarkable about the church, but there was a reason why its tall spire had attracted the professor's attention. Starting from the top of the tower, an external staircase wound around the spire, the spirals circling up into the sky.
"Let us get to the top,"
said my uncle. "I shall be dizzy," I said.
"The more reason why we should go up. We must get used to it."
"But—"
"Come, I tell you, don't waste our time."
I had to obey. A keeper who lived at the other end of the street handed us the key, and the ascent began. My uncle went ahead with a light step. I followed him without alarm, for my head was very apt to feel dizzy. I possessed neither the equilibrium of an eagle nor his fearless nature. As long as we were protected on the inside of the winding staircase up the tower, all was well enough. But after toiling up 150 steps, the fresh air came to salute my face, and we were on the leads of the tower. There the aerial staircase began its gyrations, only guarded by a thin iron rail, and the narrowing steps seemed to ascend into infinite space. "Never shall I be able to do it," I said.
"Don't be a coward. Come up, sir,"
said my uncle, with the coldest cruelty. I had to follow, clutching at every step. The keen air made me giddy. I felt the spire rocking with every gust of wind. My knees began to fail. Soon I was crawling on my knees, then creeping on my stomach. I closed my eyes. I seemed to be lost in space. At last, I reached the apex, with the assistance of my uncle dragging me up by the collar.
"Look down," he cried. "Look down well. You must take a lesson in abysses."
I opened my eyes. I saw houses squashed flat, as if they had all fallen down from the skies. A smoke fog seemed to drown them. Over my head, ragged clouds were drifting past, and by an optical inversion they seemed stationary, while the steeple, the ball, and I were all spinning along with fantastic speed. Far away on one side was the green country. On the other, the sea sparkled, bathed in sunlight. The Sound stretched away to Elsinore, dotted with a few white sails like seagulls' wings. And in the misty east and away to the northeast lay outstretched the faintly shadowed shores of Sweden. All this immensity of space whirled and wavered, fluctuating beneath my eyes. But I was compelled to rise, to stand up, to look. My first lesson in dizziness lasted an hour. When I got permission to come down and feel the solid street pavements, I was afflicted with severe lumbago.
"Tomorrow we will do it again," said the professor.
And it was so. For 5 days in succession, I was obliged to undergo this anti-vertiginous exercise, and whether I would or not, I made some improvement in the art of lofty contemplations. Chapter 9. Iceland. But what next? The day for our departure arrived. The day before it, our kind friend Monsieur Thompson brought us letters of introduction to Count Tramp, the governor of Iceland, Monsieur Picturson, the bishop suffragan, and Monsieur Finson, mayor of Reykjavik. My uncle expressed his gratitude by tremendous compressions of both his hands. On the 2nd, at 6 in the evening, all our precious baggage being safely on board the Valkyria, the captain took us into a very narrow cabin.
"Is the wind favorable?"
my uncle asked.
"Excellent,"
replied Captain Bjarne.
"A sou'easter. We shall pass down the Sound at full speed, with all sails set."
In a few minutes the schooner, under her mizzen, brigantine, topsail, and topgallant sail, loosed from her moorings and made full sail through the straits. In an hour, the capital of Denmark seemed to sink below the distant waves, and the Valkyria was skirting the coast by Elsinore. In my nervous frame of mind, I expected to see the ghost of Hamlet wandering on the legendary castle terrace. "Sublime madman," I said. "No doubt you would approve of our expedition. Perhaps you would keep us company to the center of the globe to find the solution of your eternal doubts." But there was no ghostly shape upon the ancient walls. Indeed, the castle is much younger than the heroic Prince of Denmark. It now answers the purpose of a sumptuous lodge for the doorkeeper of the Straits of the Sound, before which every year there pass 15,000 ships of all nations. The castle of Kronsberg soon disappeared in the mist, as well as the Tower of Helsingborg, built on the Swedish coast, and the schooner passed lightly on her way, urged by the breezes of the Kattegat. The Valkyria was a splendid sailor, but on a sailing vessel you can place no dependence. She was taking to Reykjavik coal, household goods, earthenware, woolen clothing, and a cargo of wheat. The crew consisted of 5 men, all Danes.
"How long will the passage take?"
my uncle asked.
10 days, the captain replied. "If we don't meet a nor'wester in passing the Faroes." But you are not subject to considerable delays.
No, Monsieur Liedenbrock, don't be uneasy. We shall get there in very good time. At evening, the schooner doubled the Skaw at the northern point of Denmark. In the night, passed the Skager Rock, skirted Norway by Cape Lindness, and entered the North Sea. In 2 days more, we sighted the coast of Scotland near Peterhead, and the Valkyria turned her lead toward the Faroe Islands, passing between the Orkneys and Shetlands. Soon the schooner encountered the great Atlantic swell. She had to tack against the north wind, and reached the Faroes only with some difficulty. On the 8th, the captain made out Meiganes, the southernmost of these islands, and from that moment took a straight course for Cape Portland, the most southerly point of Iceland. The passage was marked by nothing unusual. I bore the troubles of the sea pretty well. My uncle, to his own intense disgust and his greater shame, was ill all through the voyage. He therefore was unable to converse with the captain about Snaefell, the way to get to it, the facilities for transport. He was obliged to put off these inquiries until his arrival, and spent all his time at full length in his cabin, of which the timbers creaked and shook with every pitch she took. It must be confessed he was not undeserving of his punishment. On the 11th, we reached Cape Portland. The clear open weather gave us a good view of Myrdals Jökull, which overhangs it. The cape is merely a low hill with steep sides, standing lonely by the beach. The Valkyria kept at some distance from the coast, taking a westerly course amidst great shoals of whales and sharks. Soon we came in sight of an enormous perforated rock, through which the sea dashed furiously. The Westman Islets seemed to rise out of the ocean like a group of rocks in a liquid plain. From that time the schooner took a wide berth and swept at a great distance round Cape Reykjanes, which forms the western point of Iceland. The rough sea prevented my uncle from coming on deck to admire these shattered and surf-beaten coasts. 48 hours after, coming out of a storm, which forced the schooner to scud upon bare poles, we sighted east of us the beacon on Cape Skagen, where dangerous rocks extend far away seaward. An Icelandic pilot came on board, and in 3 hours the Valkyria dropped her anchor before Reykjavik, in Faxa Bay. The professor at last emerged from his cabin, rather pale and wretched-looking, but still full of enthusiasm, and with ardent satisfaction shining in his eyes. The population of the town, wonderfully interested in the arrival of a vessel from which everyone expected something, formed in groups upon the quay. My uncle left in haste his floating prison, or rather hospital, but before quitting the deck of the schooner, he dragged me forward, and pointing with outstretched finger north of the bay at a distant mountain terminating in a double peak, a pair of cones covered with perpetual snow, he cried, "Snaefell! Snaefell!" Then, recommending me, by an impressive gesture, to keep silence, he went into the boat which awaited him. I followed, and presently we were treading the soil of Iceland. The first man we saw was a good-looking fellow enough, in a general's uniform. Yet he was not a general, but a magistrate, the governor of the island, Monsieur le Baron Tramp himself. The professor was soon aware of the presence he was in. He delivered him his letters from Copenhagen, and then followed a short conversation in the Danish language, the purport of which I was quite ignorant of, and for a very good reason. But the result of this first conversation was that Baron Tramp placed himself entirely at the service of Professor Liedenbrock. My uncle was just as courteously received by the mayor, Monsieur Finson, whose appearance was as military, and disposition and office as pacific, as the governor's. As for the bishop's suffragan, Monsieur Picturson, he was at that moment engaged on an episcopal visitation in the north. For the time we must be resigned to wait for the honor of being presented to him. But Monsieur Friedrichsen, professor of natural sciences at the school of Reykjavik, was a delightful man, and his friendship became very precious to me. This modest philosopher spoke only Danish and Latin. He came to proffer me his good offices in the language of Horace, and I felt that we were made to understand each other. In fact, he was the only person in Iceland with whom I could converse at all. This good-natured gentleman made over to us 2 of the 3 rooms which his house contained, and we were soon installed in it, with all our luggage, the abundance of which rather astonished the good people of Reykjavik.
"Well, Axel," said my uncle, "we are getting on, and now the worst is over."
"The worst?" I said, astonished.
"To be sure. Now we have nothing to do but go down."
"Oh, if that is all, you are quite right. But after all, when we have gone down, we shall have to get up again, I suppose."
"Oh, I don't trouble myself about that. Come, there's no time to lose. I am going to the library. Perhaps there is some manuscript of Saknussum's there, and I should be glad to consult it."
"Well, while you are there, I will go into the town. Won't you?"
"Oh, that is very uninteresting to me. It is not what is upon this island, but what is underneath that interests me."
I went out, and wandered wherever chance took me. It would not be easy to lose your way in Reykjavik. I was therefore under no necessity to inquire the road, which exposes one to mistakes when the only medium of intercourse is gesture. The town extends along a low and marshy level, between 2 hills. An immense bed of lava bounds it on one side, and falls gently towards the sea. On the other extends the vast bay of Faxa, shut in at the north by the enormous glacier of the Snæfell, and of which the Valkyria was for the time the only occupant. Usually the English and French conservators of fisheries moor in this bay, but just then they were cruising about the western coasts of the island. The longest of the only 2 streets that Reykjavik possesses was parallel with the beach. Here live the merchants and traders, in wooden cabins made of red planks set horizontally. The other street, running west, ends at the little lake between the house of the bishop and other non-commercial people. I had soon explored these melancholy ways. Here and there I got a glimpse of faded turf, looking like a worn-out bit of carpet, or some appearance of a kitchen garden, the sparse vegetables of which, potatoes, cabbages, and lettuces, would have figured appropriately upon a Lilliputian table. A few sickly wallflowers were trying to enjoy the air and sunshine. About the middle of the non-commercial street, I found the public cemetery, enclosed with a mud wall, and where there seemed plenty of room. Then a few steps brought me to the governor's house, a farmhouse compared with the town hall of Hamburg, a palace in comparison with the cabins of the Icelandic population. Between the little lake and the town, the church is built in the Protestant style, of calcined stones extracted out of the volcanoes by their own labor and at their own expense. In high westerly winds, it was manifest that the red tiles of the roof would be scattered in the air, to the great danger of the faithful worshippers. On a neighboring hill I perceived the National School, where, as I was informed later by our host, were taught Hebrew, English, French, and Danish, 4 languages of which, with shame I confess it, I don't know a single word. After an examination, I should have had to stand last of the 40 scholars educated at this little college, and I should have been held unworthy to sleep along with them in one of those little double closets, where more delicate youths would have died of suffocation the very first night. In 3 hours, I had seen not only the town, but its environs. The general aspect was wonderfully dull. No trees and scarcely any vegetation. Everywhere, bare rocks, signs of volcanic action. The Icelandic huts are made of earth and turf, and the walls slope inward. They rather resemble roofs placed on the ground. But then these roofs are meadows of comparative fertility. Thanks to the internal heat, the grass grows on them to some degree of perfection. It is carefully mown in the hay season. If it were not, the horses would come to pasture on these green abodes. In my excursion, I met but few people. On returning to the main street, I found the greater part of the population busied in drying, salting, and putting on board codfish, their chief export. The men looked like robust but heavy, blond Germans with pensive eyes, conscious of being far removed from their fellow creatures. Poor exiles, relegated to this land of ice. Poor creatures, who should have been Eskimo, since nature had condemned them to live only just outside the Arctic Circle. In vain did I try to detect a smile upon their lips. Sometimes, by a spasmodic or involuntary contraction of the muscles, they seemed to laugh, but they never smiled. Their costume consisted of a coarse jacket of black woolen cloth, called in Scandinavian lands a vadmel, a hat with a very broad brim, trousers with a narrow edge of red, and a bit of leather rolled round the foot for shoes. The women looked as sad and as resigned as the men. Their faces were agreeable but expressionless, and they wore gowns and petticoats of dark vadmel. As maidens, they wore over their braided hair a little knitted brown cap. When married, they put around their heads a colored handkerchief, crowned with a peak of white linen. After a good walk, I returned to Monsieur Fridrikson's house, where I found my uncle already lost in his host's company. Chapter 10. Interesting Conversations with Icelandic Savants. Dinner was ready. Professor Liedenbrock devoured his portion voraciously, for his compulsory fast on board had converted his stomach into a vast, unfathomable gulf. There was nothing remarkable in the meal itself, but the hospitality of our host, more Danish than Icelandic, reminded me of the heroes of old. It was evident that we were more at home than he was himself. The conversation was carried on in the vernacular tongue, which my uncle mixed with German and Monsieur Fredrickson with Latin for my benefit. It turned on scientific questions as befits philosophers, but Professor Liedenbrock was excessively reserved, and at every sentence spoke to me with his eyes, enjoining the most absolute silence upon our plans. In the first place, Monsieur Fridriksson wanted to know what success my uncle had had at the library.
Your library? Why, there is nothing but a few tattered books upon almost deserted shelves.
Indeed, replied Monsieur Fridriksson. Why, we possess 8,000 volumes, many of them valuable and scarce, works in the old Scandinavian language, and we have all the novelties that Copenhagen sends us every year.
Where do you keep your 8,000 volumes? For my part—
Oh, Mr. Liedenbrock, they are all over the country. In this icy region we are fond of study. There is not a farmer nor a fisherman that cannot read and does not read. Our principle is that books, instead of growing mouldy behind an iron grating, should be worn out under the eyes of many readers. Therefore, these volumes are passed from one to another, read over and over, referred to again and again, and it often happens that they find their way back to their shelves only after an absence of a year or two.
And in the meantime, said my uncle rather spitefully, strangers—
Well, what would you have? Foreigners have their libraries at home, and the first essential for laboring people is that they should be educated. I repeat to you, the love of reading runs in Icelandic blood. In 1816 we founded a prosperous literary society. Learned strangers think themselves honored in becoming members of it. It publishes books which educate our fellow countrymen, and do the country great service. If you will consent to be a corresponding member, Herr Liedenbrock, you will be giving us great pleasure.
My uncle, who had already joined about 100 learned societies, accepted with a grace which evidently touched Monsieur Fridriksson.
Now, said he, will you be kind enough to tell me what books you hoped to find in our library, and I may perhaps enable you to consult them?
My uncle's eyes and mine met. He hesitated. This direct question went to the root of the matter, but after a moment's reflection he decided on speaking.
Monsieur Fridriksson, I wish to know if amongst your ancient books you possessed any of the works of Arne Saknussemm.
Arne Saknussemm? Replied the Reykjavik professor. You mean that learned 16th-century savant, a naturalist, a chemist, and a traveller?
Just so.
One of the glories of Icelandic literature and science?
That's the man.
An illustrious man anywhere?
Quite so.
And whose courage was equal to his genius?
I see that you know him well.
My uncle was bathed in delight at hearing his hero thus described. He feasted his eyes upon Monsieur Fridrikson's face.
"Well," he cried, "where are his works?"
"His works? We have them not."
"What? Not in Iceland?"
"They are neither in Iceland nor anywhere else."
"Why is that?"
"Because Arne Saknussemm was persecuted for heresy, and in 1573 his books were burned by the hands of the common hangman."
"Very good. Excellent," cried my uncle, to the great scandal of the professor of natural history.
"What?" he cried.
Yes, yes, now it is all clear. Now it is all unravelled, and I see why Saknussemm, put into the Index Expurgatorius, and compelled to hide the discoveries made by his genius, was obliged to bury in an incomprehensible cryptogram the secret—
"What secret?" asked Mr. Fridrikson, starting.
"Oh, just the secret which—" my uncle stammered.
"Have you some private document in your possession?" asked our host.
"No, I was only supposing a case."
"Oh, very well," answered Monsieur Fridrikson, who was kind enough not to pursue the subject when he had noticed the embarrassment of his friend. "I hope you will not leave our island until you have seen some of its mineralogical wealth."
"Certainly," replied my uncle, "but I am rather late, or have not others been here before me?"
"Yes, Herr Liedenbrock. The labours of Monsieur Olafsen and Povelsen, pursued by order of the king, the researches of Troyle, the scientific mission of Messrs. Gaimard and Robert on the French corvette La Recherche, and lately the observations of scientific men who came in the Reine Hortense, have added materially to our knowledge of Iceland. But I assure you there is plenty left."
"Do you think so?"
said my uncle, pretending to look very modest, and trying to hide the curiosity that was flashing out of his eyes. "Oh, yes. How many mountains, glaciers, and volcanoes there are to study, which are as yet but imperfectly known. Then, without going any further, that mountain on the horizon, that is Snæfell."
"Ah,"
said my uncle, as coolly as he was able. "Is that Snæfell?" "Yes, one of the most curious volcanoes, and the crater of which has scarcely ever been visited."
"Is it extinct?"
"Oh, yes, more than 500 years.
"Well,"
replied my uncle, who was frantically locking his legs together to keep himself from jumping up in the air,
"that is where I mean to begin my geological studies. There on that Fessel, what do you call it?"
"Snæfell," replied the excellent Monsieur Fridrikson. This part of the conversation was in Latin. I had understood every word of it, and I could hardly conceal my amusement at seeing my uncle trying to keep down the excitement and satisfaction which were brimming over in every limb and every feature. He tried hard to put on an innocent little expression of simplicity, but it looked like a diabolical grin.
"Yes," said he, "your words decide me. We will try to scale that Snæfell. Perhaps even we may pursue our studies in its crater."
"I am very sorry," said Monsieur Fridrikson, "that my engagements will not allow me to absent myself, or I would have accompanied you myself with both pleasure and profit."
"Oh, no," replied my uncle with great animation. "We would not disturb anyone for the world, Mr. Fridrikson. Still, I thank you with all my heart. The company of such a talented man would have been very serviceable. But the duties of your profession—"
I am glad to think that our host, in the innocence of his Icelandic soul, was blind to the transparent artifices of my uncle. "I very much approve of your beginning with that volcano, Monsieur Liedenbrock. You will gather a harvest of interesting observations. But tell me, how do you expect to get to the peninsula of Snæfell?"
"By sea, crossing the bay. That's the most direct way."
"No doubt, but it is impossible."
"Why?"
"Because we don't possess a single boat at Reykjavik."
"You don't mean to say so?"
"You will have to go by land, following the shore. It will be longer, but more interesting."
"Very well, then. And now I shall have to see about a guide."
"I have one to offer you."
A safe, intelligent man.
Yes, an inhabitant of that peninsula. He is an eider-down hunter, and very clever. He speaks Danish perfectly.
When can I see him?
Tomorrow, if you like.
Why not today?
Because he won't be here till tomorrow.
Tomorrow, then, added my uncle with a sigh.
This momentous conversation ended in a few minutes with warm acknowledgments paid by the German to the Icelandic professor. At this dinner, my uncle had just elicited important facts, amongst others, the history of Saknussemm, the reason of the mysterious document, that his host would not accompany him in his expedition, and that the very next day a guide would be waiting upon him. This is B.J. Harrison. I hope you've enjoyed this unabridged production of A Journey to the Center of the Earth, Part 2 of 9 by Jules Verne. If you've enjoyed this episode, please become a supporting member by going to ClassicTalesAudiobooks.com and clicking the appropriate button. And thanks for pitching in. Thank you for joining me today and allowing classic literature to awaken your better self. Please join me next time, and we'll rediscover the greatest stories ever put to paper.